For me, it was the Whitney Plantation. The Whitney Plantation is located outside of New Orleans, and it is the only plantation on the mainland that tells the story of plantation life from the perspective of the enslaved people. My visit was about 6 years ago, and I was part of a group made up of both African Americans and European Americans who were on a 10-day civil rights tour through the South. This group had been meeting for about 3 years, and the church I was part of was from a suburb of New York City, way west suburb in New Jersey, and the African American group was from a church in Harlem. And we'd been studying and going on retreats together, reading books together, watching movies, and we were attempting to be about the work of undoing racism. And a lot of our work culminated in this 10-day trip through the South to visit civil rights locations, and one of those locations was the Whitney Plantation. I have to tell you, the experience was very impactful. In fact, I thought it brought together for me years of learning and growing, reading, making progress, then feeling like maybe I wasn't making so much progress in my understanding of race and white privilege and the part that I played in that. See, white privilege, that frame of reference, is so embedded in one's life. It takes such effort and, I believe, time and attention and effort to truly begin to get a handle on what the impact has been in our culture, our society, our lives. But at the Whitney Plantation, it just seemed to become so much clearer how that frame of reference was defining how one sees life. That frame of reference would bring comfort. But also what was so clear is that frame of reference was so limiting. To tour that plantation, to see the remnants of buildings that remain, to hear what life was like for the enslaved people, and to do all of that with African Americans, again, was just so moving and so impactful. Jesus had spent some years with the disciples. What we often are struck with in the Gospels is that Jesus chooses these very ordinary people to be his followers. And we follow through the Gospels their ability and their progress in coming to terms with who Jesus really was and what his mission was all about. It took, again, a lot of learning, and sometimes there was progress, sometimes there wasn't. They saw Jesus as this miracle worker, as a rabbi, as a teacher, maybe as a Messiah. Maybe as a Messiah who is going to be a political figure and bring in a new government, overthrow the Romans that were occupying the region. There would be arguments about who would be in what position in a possible overthrow. The disciples struggled. See, they had a frame of reference that was so embedded in their lives that it was difficult to grasp what Jesus was all about and what his ministry meant and what they would be called on to continue. The passage of the Transfiguration is found embedded in between narratives about the road to Jerusalem, the cross and resurrection. And at this point, it is that Jesus brings the core disciples with him up on this mount. Again, the road to Jerusalem was very near now. And it was on this mount, maybe a little bit like the Whitney plantation experience for me, that these core disciples would have that opportunity to truly have their frame of reference changed, expanded, maybe even adapt a totally new way of understanding Jesus and life and their ministry. I believe we can look at the experience on this mount and almost see directly how it speaks to what goes into our frame of references that we hold in our lives. You know, they're created through our experiences, our knowledge, education. I think also the culture we grow up in helps to develop that frame of reference. Even the language we use can have a part in that. But it's almost as if on this mount, the experience spoke to how that frame of reference defines how we can understand life, becomes a comfort zone for us, and limits how we understand what life and other people are all about. See, the first thing that happens is that Jesus is glorified. See, the disciples had a struggle how they should define who Jesus really was and what he had come to do and what he was really about. But the first thing happens, and that's this glorification. And they see the true divinity of Jesus, who this Jesus truly is. God come to be with us, Emmanuel, God with us. And then when they see these historical figures show up, they have a level of comfort because they were Jews. They knew their history and their law. And what did they want to do? They wanted to stay. They wanted to build shelters and just stay there. See, the old frame of reference is one of comfort. And so they fell back into that, but Jesus tells them, no, that's not going to happen. And then they hear the voice of God. See, a frame of reference limits our understanding of our lives. And in hearing that voice, they were in a thin place, a thin space. They understood that the eternal is among us. And if the eternal is breaking into our temporal lives, the material world, there are no limits. So the frame of references that they had been operating from and the limits of those frames of references no longer would apply. For the disciples, that Mount of Transfigurations, that core group of disciples, it was like their Whitney plantation. I think about us as we prepare to enter Lent on Wednesday. We've been talking about opening our lives to the presence of God, opening to God and that light, opening to others. We need to think about opening our frame of reference. Maybe it's this Lent that can be that time for us, like that mount, like that plantation. Maybe as we are willing to be attentive and understand the thin place and space we are in between the temporal and eternal. Maybe it's this Lent where we're willing to redefine our understanding who God is. Maybe it's this Lent where we'll be willing to move out of our comfort zones. Maybe it's this Lent where we will not keep our lives so limited, but understand that when the eternal is among us, there are no limits as we understand limits in our human knowledge. I think of the congregation of Central Union. Also during this time period, we have an opportunity, a new vision, But that can be such a challenge because of those frames of references that we carry in our lives that are so embedded, even though we've maybe worked on it and we've read and we've learned and we've made some progress now and then, yet we are still encumbered by some old frames of reference. And maybe as we are willing to be attentive to God, maybe as we are willing to look forward to a new vision, we can allow that frame of reference to change or to no longer even exist. How it is we define how we understand church, where we think we're comfortable, that comfort zone we want to stay in, or how we limit what is possible. See, in a thin space when the eternal has come to be among us, in a thin space when we are moving toward the cross and resurrection and the power of the resurrection and God's love that nothing can overcome, we understand that we can truly live a life of no limits. To God be the glory. Amen.